Welcome to the making of Love in the Time of Advertising, the making of the grass, in which we will cover using V-Ray proxies to create grass for the short film. So to start off, we're going to create a single blade of grass, and then we're going to duplicate it to create several different variations of this. We'll want the grass here to have thickness. You don't really want to skimp on this, I've found, actually, so having grass that's modeled realistically to the actual stock is worth the extra little bit of geo. And you can see here that I'm using the soft select tool to create variation in this this first duplicated stock. Now we've created several different variations of these graph stocks, which should be enough for us to work with. I'll go ahead and I'll zero out their translate transforms to get them back to the origin to make them more usable when we paint with them. Now that we have everything zeroed out, I'm going to go ahead and clean this up by renaming them and grouping them. This is going to be our original grass group, and I will name it accordingly. This way we can track it down later from the painted grass that we have. Now I'm going to use Comet and Rename to go through and rename each individual blade of grass. I feel that having a clean workspace is always beneficial later down the line when you're trying to figure stuff out. There we go. We have a nice clean outliner now. I'm going to go ahead and create a ground plane to use as my base for painting the grass onto. So I want to make it about the size that I'm interested in painting it. Now we're going to paint a single patch of grass and then use that to paint larger areas of grass using V-Ray proxies. So here I've opened SP Paint 3D, a script that you can find in Creative Crash, and I'm creating variation in the scale after I've added the brush geometry, the grass blades, and the target surface, the ground plane that I made. I'm also adding some variation to the rotations so that on all axes there's variations in each individual painted grass. Now it'll paint randomly selected from the stocks, you can see, and then the distance between each single painted piece of grass is controlled by the distance threshold. Now we have our painted grass, which I've went ahead and filled in. We'll go ahead and delete that ground plane and select it all. You can see I have a fairly clean outliner. I'm going to hide my original grass so that doesn't get included with everything else. I'm going to scale it down a little bit just because it looks a little too tall for what purposes we're going to use it for. I'd already set up a shader using just a color map going into the diffuse channel. Now none of this is color corrected right now for linear workspace, but you could do that accordingly. I've mapped the reflection color by using a ramp to color correct it, and I've turned on Use for Now, which I feel creates more realistic reflections on our surfaces. And then I like to pump my ramps into a luminance node when I'm using it for mapping reflection glossiness. I also, instead of using an SSS, like to use the V-Ray two-sided material instead, with the color map as a translucency texture. SSS on massive amounts of surfaces tends to give V-Ray some problems, I found, throughout making the short film, so just a lesson learned kind of thing. And now I'm going to go through and go ahead and open up the Create V-Ray proxy window. I'm going to go ahead and bring the faces down to 500. I probably would even go lower if I wasn't going to use the bounding box later on. Now you can see you can export animation, but we're not going to in this circumstance. We're going to go ahead and rename the mesh to something descriptive and make sure that the path is pointing to the right location. And there we go. It looks pretty good, so let's go ahead and create the proxy. Alright, the final thing we have to do before we start painting with our proxies is export out the shader, which doesn't tend to get exported out with the proxy itself. So I'm just going to go into the Hypershade and export that selected network. Okay, now we're in a brand new scene and we're ready to import our proxy mesh that we exported into this scene. So I'm going to hit import V-Ray proxy. I'm going to rename the node just so that it's descriptive when it shows up in my outliner. And then I'm going to point it to the VR mesh file that we exported out. There we go. We hit create. And we can see we have our 500 poly V-Ray proxy. I like to use a bounding box, so that's only 6 sides. That's up to you. And then unless you're getting close, I usually hit don't set normals, which is faster. It doesn't always bring in the shader with it, so we have to go ahead and import that in through the Hypershade. So we'll go ahead and pull the shader that we created and export it out. We're going to go ahead and find that that slot on the V-Ray proxy, and we're going to drag and drop it in. And then out of habit, I'll click on it and I'll hit enter because sometimes it won't connect. So now we have our proxy all set up and ready to go. We're going to create another ground plane. This ground plane would be whatever you want to paint your grass on, your final grass surface to be on. We're also going to use SP Paint again. So put in the target surface, our ground plane, and the brush geometry, and we're going to go ahead and create some variation in the scale and the rotation. And then under options, which I didn't record here, you need to make sure that preserve input connections is checked, or else it won't connect the proxy to each one. I did have to raise the distance threshold since we're working at a larger scale. Went ahead and painted this all out. So this is an example of how you could paint grass over a large surface. You can see that it uses up a much smaller geometry footprint, and it'll replace these proxies when it gets to the final render. And now if we click around, you can see that each one of these boxes has the grass medium mesh, V-Ray mesh connected to it, so that when we render, it should render correctly. Here's an example of one of our frames from Love in the Time of Advertising, the short film, using V-Ray proxies to create the grass. Thanks for watching this making of Love in the Time of Advertising, the making of the grass. I hope you find all this information useful. Thank you for listening.